In the morning of 2008, I was woken up by a phone call. Though I generally sleep well, I always wake up instantly when the phone rings. The call came from a man, and receiving a call from a man at this hour wasn't something to be thrilled about. My friends don't usually call me this early for drinks, and my family wouldn't call me on my work phone, so it must have been a client. The voice on the other end was deep and strong, reminding me of my high school history teacher. He said he had a problem at home and needed help. I told him, "I figured as much. That's why you're calling me." He went on to explain that his wife seemed to be possessed by a ghost, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, and she was too afraid to leave the house. I told him, "How about this? Come to my place and let's talk." After hanging up, about an hour later, he showed up near my apartment. I gave him the exact address, cleaned up a bit, and waited for him in the living room. The moment he walked in, I felt a little self-conscious. He looked like someone who was only a few years older than me, handsome, tall, and one of those rich and handsome types. He spoke in a loud voice, and despite coming to me for help with something supernatural, he extended his hand for a handshake. This threw me off a bit. Most of the people who come to me for help usually have a look of desperation, like I'm their last hope. They act as if they're drowning, desperate to show me how miserable they are. At first, I felt sympathy for them, but over time, as I got used to these cases, I started to appreciate ghosts, even the ones who meant harm. At least they were straightforward about their malice. I made him some tea and invited him to sit down. I told him to explain everything in detail. He said his name was Robert, 35 years old, and he had been married for 8 years. He came to me because of his wife, whose name was Sarah. Sarah couldn't come in person because she was too frightened to leave the house. Her mother was staying with them to take care of her. I asked what had happened. Robert explained that one night after Sarah returned from playing mahjong, she asked him why he had left an apple core in the passenger seat. He was surprised and said, "I didn't put that there." Sarah responded, "You were driving earlier today, and when I got in, I saw the apple core. Who else could it be?" They argued for a bit, but Robert insisted it wasn't him. They both eventually forgot about it until a few weeks later, when things took a darker turn. Robert said, "About a month ago, Sarah went out to meet a friend for coffee. When she was driving out of the garage, the elderly man at the toll booth recognized her and joked, 'Out this late for some fun?' Sarah didn't think much of it at the time. She just brushed it off and drove away. But after that night, she began to feel like something was off. When Robert asked her what was wrong, she couldn't explain it. All she said was that her right arm felt sore, like it had been burned or frozen. They thought it might be muscle pain or rheumatism, so they didn't pay much attention to it. But a few days later, Sarah went shopping, and when she was bringing the groceries into the garage, her arm hurt so badly she had to rest in the toll booth office. The old man helped her carry the bags and even drove her home. Along the way, he said something that terrified Sarah. He told her, "I've lived here for years, but I never knew you had such a pretty sister." Sarah was confused. "I don't have a sister." "What do you mean?" she asked. The old man insisted, "But I've seen you drive with her. She always sits in the passenger seat, holds your purse, and eats an apple. Wasn't that your sister?" Robert told me they only had one car, which he drove during the day for work. If Sarah went out at night, she drove it herself. The old man must have seen Sarah at night, which made his comment even more unsettling. After hearing the old man's words, Sarah started to overthink it. Eventually, she became terrified and stopped leaving the house. She couldn't sleep and she couldn't eat. She even started keeping the curtains open during the day and the lights on at night. Within just a few days, she had become a shell of herself. They consulted a local spiritual healer, but the healer canceled the next day, saying he was sick. Desperate, Robert turned to me for help. After hearing Robert's story, it was clear to me that this place was definitely haunted. As I've said before, if life is a straight line, then infants and the elderly are at the two ends of that line. At these two stages in life, it's not uncommon for them to see things that we, in our prime, can't. This helps explain why most of the people writing obituaries and mourning banners at funeral homes are elderly. And if I told you that most of them can see things we can't, you might not believe me. In our tradition, the people who help at funerals, those who write mourning banners, are usually divided into two types, one who can see things and one who cannot. The ones who cannot see act as laborers, while those who can see are the eyes. When ghosts appear at a funeral, the eyes direct the laborers to approach the spirit and guide it out the back door. It's not just a myth, this custom is almost identical to what you see in films. Robert continued, saying it wasn't over. Before Sarah's situation worsened, he had driven out one night, and the elderly toll booth worker had once again smiled slyly and said, "Your wife's not home? Out having fun." At the time, Robert didn't understand what the old man meant. He just thought the guy was making small talk. He had forgotten about it until a few days ago when Sarah's issues came back and he remembered the strange comment. After hearing Robert's story, I knew I had to handle it, but whether I could solve it was uncertain. I never make promises without being sure, because raising expectations too high could ruin my reputation. On the other hand, if I don't set high expectations and succeed, they'll be impressed. I get the psychology behind it. I told Robert, if it's convenient, I'll come to your house and talk to Sarah. We took a cab to a neighborhood in Los Angeles, and it was clear this couple was terrified. They even had a car but wouldn't drive it. When we arrived at their apartment, I immediately felt a heavy, oppressive presence. Despite the bright lights, a large statue of a saint stood near the entrance. It made me wonder if they were involved in some kind of religious group. These thoughts were fleeting. The oppressive feeling didn't just come from the statue. It also came from the large mirror wall in the living room. I figured it had been installed to make the space feel bigger, but the decorations, like a sword and a small mirror above it, made it feel even stranger. This family definitely had some superstitions based on their decor, but I was certain there was no ghost in the house. Based on the layout and the types of items and the direction of the windows and doors, only a very powerful spirit would dare enter. It was clear they were wealthy. The rich and handsome type as expected. I followed Robert into the bedroom and saw Sarah sitting curled up in the center of the bed, her legs tucked underneath her. Her mother was sitting on the opposite side of the bed, watching her. When Robert greeted her, Sarah looked up. I couldn't tell if it was due to the exhaustion from the past few days, but she looked much older than Robert and was heavier than I expected. On the way here, Robert had told me they didn't have any children, despite trying many times. Sarah had always been unable to conceive. She must have known I was coming, and perhaps it was her idea to reach out to someone like me. I walked up to the bed, greeted her politely, and then with a tone of certainty, told her, "You don't need to worry. There are absolutely no ghosts in your house. You don't have to be afraid here." Maybe my words helped. Perhaps it was the confidence in my voice and the fact that I was a professional that reassured her. People often put themselves under immense pressure in certain situations, as if they're stretched taut like an elastic band, and even a small touch can cause them to snap. At these times, they just need someone trustworthy and a comforting word to relieve the tension. I wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings between what Robert had told me and Sarah's version of events. While I comforted her, I asked her to repeat what had happened. The story was largely the same, but she did add one detail. She had confronted Robert about the apple core because he loved apples more than anyone she knew. She had immediately assumed it was him since he always ate apples. She also mentioned that she often felt like someone had been touching her purse. Before, she always left her handbag in the passenger seat when driving, but the toll booth man had said he'd seen a woman sitting in the passenger seat holding her purse. Now, she didn't even dare touch her own purse anymore. Sometimes, when small things happen around you, they can become big issues if you don't pay close attention. But when strange explanations are forced into a world we don't understand, everything starts to feel supernatural. I spent some time comforting Sarah, then signaled to Robert to step outside with me. Once we were outside, he asked where we were going. I told him, "We need to ask that old man at the toll booth." Their building had an elevator that went straight down to the garage, so it would be easier to take the elevator. We walked about 200 meters from the elevator, past a barrier, and saw a small guard booth painted in pale green. Robert pointed out that this was the toll booth. I walked straight up to the booth, where the elderly man in his 60s was sitting. When he saw Robert approaching, he greeted him from a distance. Robert asked him if he could recall anything unusual from the night Sarah went out and whether he had seen anything in the car. The old man thought for a moment and said, "Oh, that night I saw you driving with a little sister. I figured you were going out for fun. I saw the girl, but she wasn't your wife, so I joked around." Robert was shocked, realizing that there must have been something sinister in the car that night. He quickly asked, "Where was this girl sitting?" The old man replied, "She was sitting right behind you, holding your neck with both hands, but her eyes were empty." At this point, Robert seemed visibly shaken, and I could understand why. I began to imagine if I had been in his place, driving and feeling a ghostly woman behind me, touching my neck without even realizing it. The thought was terrifying. I continued to ask the old man, "Do you remember the woman who was in Sarah's car a few days ago? Is she the same person? What did she look like?" The old man nodded. "Of course I remember. She was a young girl, dressed in something like a wedding dress or a gown. She had long, straight hair and looked very pretty. She was just sitting there eating an apple very quietly." The old man suddenly seemed to realize something, his eyes flashing with fear. I told him, "What you saw wasn't a person, it was a ghost." He looked at me, his expression serious, and after seeing my certainty in his own recollection, he immediately believed me. I asked if there were any surveillance cameras in the parking lot. He confirmed there were, one by the entrance and another by the gate. I asked him to show me the footage, and although he was scared, he agreed. We went to the monitoring room where a young security guard was playing on his phone. I almost mistook him for a policeman, given the uniform color. The old man spoke to the young guard, telling him to copy the surveillance footage for a few minutes, claiming Robert's car had been scratched and they were looking for evidence. The young guard agreed. For the next hour, Robert, the old man, and I sat in the monitoring room, reviewing the footage of the night Sarah had gone out. Eventually, we found the clip of that night, and sure enough, we saw a thin woman sitting in the passenger seat. However, the angle didn't show her face, it was hidden by the side of the car. The old man pointed at the screen, exclaiming, "That's her! That's her!" He clasped his hands together and began chanting. I asked Robert to remember the exact day he had gone out, and once he told me, I fast-forwarded to that specific part of the footage. This time, we could clearly see the woman's face as she was seated directly on the passenger side. The moment I saw her face, I noticed Robert seemed a little dazed, almost like he was in shock. His lips turned pale, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He trembled and whispered, "I know this woman." The room fell eerily silent. I motioned for the old man to step outside, and once he left, I turned to Robert asking, "What's going on here? Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" He kept his eyes fixed on the screen, and after a long pause, he told me a shocking story. The woman in the video was a college student named Mia, whom Robert had met at a party years ago. They began an affair, and over the course of a year, Mia became his mistress. Eventually, Sarah found out, and it caused a huge confrontation. Robert had to promise to never see Mia again, and things settled down after a while. But 2 years ago, Mia unexpectedly showed up at Robert's apartment dressed beautifully, and in a fit of anger and sadness, she threw herself from the top of the building. She died instantly. At first, the authorities classified it as a suicide, but Robert and Sarah were the only ones who knew the full truth. They decided to keep it a secret and never spoke about it again. But now, 3 years later, Mia's spirit was back, haunting them both. I was furious that Robert hadn't told me about his involvement in Mia's death sooner. But of course, it wasn't my business. I was just an outsider hired to help, and it wasn't my place to meddle in personal matters. From what I knew so far, Mia's ghost was targeting Robert and Sarah specifically. Earlier, Sarah had mentioned that her right arm had been sore. This could be the result of Mia sitting next to her in the passenger seat or some other influence. I continued reviewing the footage and finally found the moment Sarah left the garage. Slowing it down, I saw Mia sitting in the passenger seat, holding something different than before. This time, it was Sarah's lipstick, which Mia was applying to her lips. If I had seen this scene in a different context, I might have found it beautiful. But knowing now that Mia was dead, it was incredibly chilling. At that moment, Robert told me something else that sent a chill down my spine. He said that several times after parking and entering the elevator, he'd been on the phone. only to realize once the elevator doors closed that he hadn't pressed the button for his floor. His apartment was on the 28th floor. By the time he realized it, the light for the 28th floor was already on. This had happened a few times, but he hadn't thought much of it. But now, with all this strange activity, he couldn't ignore it any longer. We started searching through the elevator surveillance footage. Robert checked his phone's call log and gave me the exact date. I searched the footage for that day and found the exact clip he mentioned. As expected, the footage showed Robert entering the elevator while talking on the phone. After the doors closed, a woman emerged from the blind spot below the camera and pressed the 28th floor button, then stood very close behind him. When Robert got off, she backed up into the blind spot again. Watching the footage sent a chill down my spine. It was horrifying to think about, but still, I couldn't tell whether Mia was trying to hurt him or just trying to communicate with him. She wasn't a resident of the building, so there was no way to trace her. I had to call an elderly woman who was known for being skilled at walking the in spiritual rituals. I asked Robert to provide Mia's full name and birth date so she could help us make contact with the spirit. About an hour later, I received a call back from the elderly woman. She told me Mia's story. Mia was young, beautiful, and full of life. After meeting Robert at a party, they began an affair. Mia quickly fell in love with him, but deep down, she knew he could never offer her the happiness she wanted. She tried to accept her situation, thinking, if I can be happy for just a day, it'll be enough. To please Robert, she even started eating the apples he loved so much. As Robert had told me, eventually Sarah found out, and there was a huge confrontation. To save his marriage, Robert hurt Mia, he cut ties with her and promised never to see her again. After the breakup, Mia fell into despair. She was angry at Robert and Sarah, but she still loved him more than she hated them. These conflicting emotions drove her to suicide. But even in death, she couldn't let go. She wanted Robert and his wife to know, I'm Mia, I'm dead, and I died near your home. She wanted them to think of her every year. So that day, she dressed up in her best clothes, came to Robert's building, and threw herself from the 28th floor. She chose to jump into the elevator shaft, hoping to spare Robert from seeing her broken body. Even as she jumped, she still held on to her love for him. The elderly woman explained that souls of those who die by suicide are often unable to leave and become trapped. Mia's spirit had been following Robert and Sarah ever since her death. While she hadn't intended to hurt Sarah, her attachment to Robert seemed to manifest as mischief. The elderly woman also told me that Mia had left behind a green high-heeled shoe at the scene of her death, which still lay at the bottom of the elevator shaft. After thanking the elderly woman and getting off the phone, I relayed the information to Robert. When he heard the full story, he collapsed to the floor, overcome with guilt. The image of the rich and handsome Robert was shattered as he cried in despair. With the old man's help, we managed to locate the high heel in the elevator shaft. With this physical evidence in hand, it became easier to find a solution. I had initially thought about tying a knot with red string for Robert and Mia, but I realized that it wasn't my place to do so. Even though Mia loved him, Robert didn't deserve that love. Once the high heel and red string were burned, I knew Mia's spirit could finally rest. Robert thanked me repeatedly, and I received my payment. As he drove me to the gate of the apartment complex, I said to him, "Some things aren't worth playing with. What you sow, you will reap. You've made your mistakes, but don't keep repeating them. You need to find Mia's grave, and every year on the Qingming Festival, Chinese New Year, her death anniversary, and Valentine's Day, you must go there and burn incense to pay your respects and apologize." Mia, though morally questionable, was still a woman who loved without asking for anything in return. In my eyes, her love was pure and real. If you're interested in my videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.